What makes a man who feels absolutely nothing suddenly shatter a glass in his own hand? For the head of one of New York's most powerful crime families, it took exactly one thing: watching his loyal, plus-size assistant, the woman he'd looked straight through for 7 years, walk into a ballroom on another man's arm, laughing in a way he'd never once bothered to earn. He didn't share. And he was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Rocco Salvatore did not share. He was the undisputed head of the Salvatore family, a multi-billion-dollar empire built on underground casinos, high-end extortion, and a legitimate shipping front that controlled half the ports on the eastern seaboard. From his penthouse office overlooking Central Park, Rocco ruled his world with cold, calculating precision. He was a man made of sharp edges, bespoke suits, and a terrifyingly calm demeanor. Women, to him, were currency: tall, willowy, size 0 socialites and runway models who decorated his arm at charity galas and asked 0 questions about why his private jet to Geneva carried untraceable bearer bonds. And then there was Delaney Cole. Delaney was Rocco's executive assistant, his confidant, his fixer, and the only person alive who knew the exact combination to the biometric safe hidden behind the painting in his office. She was also a woman who stood in stark contrast to the superficial world Rocco lived in. Delaney was fat. A lush, soft, size 18 woman with generous curves, a quick wit, and a brilliant mind that could launder $5 million through dummy corporations before her morning latte went cold. For 7 years, Delaney had been the invisible anchor holding Rocco's chaotic life together, managing his ruthless schedule, navigating his violent temper, organizing everything with military precision. She wore muted, oversized black blazers and sensible flats, deliberately blending into the background of his flashy, dangerous world. To the captains and underbosses of the family, Delaney was untouchable, not out of respect, but because Rocco would violently dismantle anyone who dared disrespect his most valuable asset. And yet, for all his unspoken protectiveness, Rocco took her entirely for granted. He looked right through her. In his mind, Delaney was a constant, sexless entity, a brilliant machine that existed solely to serve him. He never noticed the way her chestnut hair caught the light, or how her brown eyes softened when she looked at him. He never knew that for 7 years Delaney had carried a quiet, agonizing love for her boss. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday evening at a 3-Michelin-star restaurant in Midtown. Rocco was hosting a tense sit-down with Victor Renna, the volatile heir to a rival crime family. Delaney had spent weeks building the dossier, making sure Rocco had exactly the leverage he needed to force Victor into conceding a lucrative union contract. She stood discreetly in the corner of the private dining room, clutching her tablet to her chest, her sensible black dress blending into the shadows. "Your operation's airtight, Salvatore. I'll give you that," Victor sneered, swirling his wine, his predatory gaze drifting to Delaney. "And you trust your little secretary here with all these numbers. She looks like she eats the profits." A few of Victor's men snickered. Delaney's face burned, her grip on the tablet tightening until her knuckles went white. She waited for Rocco to say something. Anything. To defend her, to shut Victor down with that terrifying icy glare he reserved for enemies. Instead, Rocco didn't even glance her way. He kept his eyes locked on Victor, his voice completely detached. "She's just the help, Victor. Focus on the contract. She only processes what I tell her to process. Just the help." The words hit Delaney with the force of a physical blow. 7 years of unwavering loyalty, of cleaning up his messes, of putting his life ahead of her own, reduced to 3 dismissive words. And in that sterile, opulent room, something inside her finally snapped. She wasn't angry. She was exhausted. The illusion was gone. Rocco would never see her as a woman. He would never see her as an equal. The next morning, Delaney walked into a high-end boutique during her lunch break. She stopped hiding. She traded her oversized, shapeless blazers for a wardrobe that hugged her lush figure. But more importantly, she decided it was time to get a life outside the Salvatore world entirely. Enter Julian Marsh. Delaney met Julian completely by accident 2 days later at a coffee shop near Rockefeller Plaza. She'd dropped her leather binder, scattering classified shipping manifests across the floor, and Julian, a strikingly handsome man with a sharp jaw, tailored navy slacks, and an air of relaxed confidence, knelt to help her. When his hand brushed hers, he didn't look at her with the pity or the invisibility she was used to from Manhattan's elite. He looked at her with genuine, unbridled interest. "You look like you're carrying the weight of Wall Street in this binder," Julian joked, handing it back, his hazel eyes sweeping over her soft curves with blatant appreciation. For the first time in years, Delaney flirted back. Julian was charming, intelligent, and entirely outside the mafia ecosystem. He told her he was a corporate consultant who'd just moved to the city from London. By the time their coffees were ready, he'd asked her to accompany him to an annual charity masquerade gala at a famous hotel, the very same gala Rocco was attending to secure political favors. "I'd love to," Delaney heard herself say, surprising herself. For the rest of the week, Delaney was a ghost in Rocco's office. She did her job flawlessly, but the warmth was gone. She stopped bringing him his espresso before he asked. She stopped lingering in his doorway to banter about his terrible taste in neckties. And Rocco felt the shift. A cold, nagging irritation settled in his chest, a sensation he couldn't identify and absolutely hated. He was the boss. He dictated the temperature of every room he walked into. But suddenly, his own assistant was freezing him out, and it made him deeply, dangerously restless. The grand ballroom of the hotel was a sea of glittering chandeliers, gold-leaf architecture, and Manhattan's most dangerous predators in $1,000 tuxedos. Rocco stood near the champagne tower, looking utterly bored. Clinging to his arm was a Russian runway model whose waist was narrower than his thigh, prattling on about a yacht trip, completely oblivious to the fact that he wasn't listening to a single word. Rocco's sharp eyes scanned the room, his jaw clenched. He was irritated. Delaney was supposed to be here an hour ago to hand off a decrypted drive containing the offshore accounts of a corrupt state senator. But she was late, and Delaney Cole was never late. He pulled out his phone, ready to demand her presence, when the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open. The murmurs started first, a low ripple of whispers sweeping through the crowd like wildfire. Rocco looked up, annoyed by the distraction, and felt his breath violently catch in his throat. Standing at the top of the grand staircase was Delaney. But it wasn't the Delaney he knew. No shapeless blazer, no sensible flats. She was poured into a custom emerald green silk gown that clung to every lush curve, draping magnificently over her wide hips and cinching tight at her waist, revealing an hourglass figure he'd never allowed himself to see. A deep V neckline left a generous amount of skin exposed. A delicate diamond choker rested against her collarbone. Her chestnut hair, usually pulled into a severe bun, cascaded down her shoulders in thick, glamorous waves. She looked like a Renaissance painting brought to breathtaking life. She looked beautiful. She looked untouchable. And she wasn't alone. Her hand rested confidently on the crook of a man's arm, tall, impeccably dressed in a midnight blue velvet tuxedo with an easy, commanding smile. He leaned in and whispered something that made Delaney throw her head back and laugh, a bright, genuine sound Rocco realized he hadn't heard in years. The crystal tumbler in his hand shattered. Bourbon and blood dripped over his knuckles, soaking into the pristine white cuff of his shirt. The model gasped and stepped back in horror, but Rocco didn't even notice. The world had narrowed to a tunnel, and at the end of it was the man whose hand rested possessively on Delaney's waist. A primal, suffocating wave of jealousy slammed into his chest, a violent, ugly emotion that completely bypassed his legendary self-control. His anchor, his loyal assistant, his Delaney. Standing in a room full of sharks, glowing under another man's attention. Rocco didn't think. He moved, crossing the ballroom with predatory strides, his captain sensing the shift and falling into step behind him. The crowd parted, feeling the lethal tension radiating off him. Delaney was at the bar, accepting a glass of champagne from Julian when the temperature seemed to plummet. She turned, her breath hitching to find Rocco inches away, his dark eyes burning, tracing the neckline of her dress before snapping to her face. "Mr. Salvatore," she said, admirably steady despite her racing heart, reaching into her clutch. "I have the drive you asked for." "Keep it," Rocco interrupted, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't look at the drive. He looked at Julian, who had positioned himself slightly in front of Delaney, a subtle protective gesture that made Rocco want to rip his throat out on the marble floor. "Julian Marsh," the man said smoothly, extending a hand. "I've heard a lot about you." Rocco didn't take it. He stared at it like a venomous snake, then shifted his lethal gaze back to his assistant. "Since when do you date?" he demanded, ignoring all etiquette, his voice thick with accusation, as if she'd committed treason. Delaney's spine stiffened. The memory of his dismissive words at the restaurant flashed in her mind, hardening her resolve. "I have a personal life outside the office, Mr. Salvatore, or did you assume I power down in a charging station under my desk at 6? A muscle feathered in Rocco's jaw. "You don't have a personal life I don't know about. You're my executive assistant. You hold state secrets in your head. You don't just pick up random men at coffee shops." "He's not a random man," Delaney shot back, her brown eyes flashing. "And who I spend my evening with is none of your concern. Now, if you'll excuse us." Rocco took a step closer, crowding her, forcing Julian to shift his stance, and leaned down, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper meant only for her. "He doesn't know you, Delaney. He doesn't know what you do for me, the ledgers you clean. You think a man in a velvet suit can handle the reality of your life?" Before she could answer, Julian smoothly stepped directly between them, the easy smile gone, replaced by a cold, calculating mask that set off warning bells in Rocco's head. "I think the lady asked for some space, Salvatore." Rocco let out a dark, humorless chuckle. "You have no idea who you're talking to, Marsh. Walk away from her. Now." "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Julian replied smoothly, leaning in a fraction. "And I think Victor Renna would be highly entertained to see the great Rocco Salvatore throwing a public tantrum over his secretary." Rocco froze. The air vanished from his lungs. Marsh. Julian Marsh. The pieces slammed together in his brain. This wasn't some random consultant from London. Julian Marsh was the ruthless, ghost-like legal counsel and fixer for the Renna family. Victor Renna's right-hand man, the one who orchestrated the disappearance of federal witnesses. And he had his hands all over the woman who held the keys to Rocco's entire empire. Rocco looked at Delaney, who seemed genuinely confused by the exchange, clearly unaware of Julian's true identity. Panic and a terrifying possessiveness collided inside him. He grabbed her wrist, his grip ironclad but careful not to bruise. "We're leaving. Now." The heavy brass doors of the hotel shut behind them with a resounding thud, cutting off the orchestral music. Outside, a sudden torrential downpour was washing the neon-lit streets, matching the storm raging in Rocco's chest. He didn't release her wrist until they reached the curb, where his armored black car was already waiting, engine purring like a caged beast. His driver, Marcus, opened the rear door, eyes wide at the sight of his boss practically dragging the impeccably dressed assistant through the rain. "Get in!" Rocco barked. "Don't you dare command me like one of your foot soldiers!" Delaney fired back, planting her stilettos firmly on the wet pavement, raindrops kissing her bare shoulders and ruining her perfect waves. "You humiliated me in there. You treated me like property." Rocco stepped into her space, his towering frame shielding her from the brunt of the storm. "You have absolutely no idea what you just walked into, Delaney. Get in the car before I throw you over my shoulder and put you in there myself." Realizing he was genuinely operating on the edge of violence, she snatched her wrist away, hiked up the heavy silk of her gown, and slid into the opulent leather interior. Rocco slid in beside her, slamming the door hard enough to shake the vehicle. "The penthouse, now!" he ordered through the partition. The car surged forward. For 3 blocks, the only sound was the windshield wipers and their ragged breathing. Delaney pressed herself against the door, arms wrapped around her curves. Are you going to explain why you just started a potential gang war in the middle of a charity gala? She demanded, trembling but cold. Or should I draft the apology letter to the board first thing tomorrow? Rocco unbuttoned his ruined jacket, knuckles still smeared with dried blood. He turned to her, the dim light casting harsh shadows across his face. That man, he growled, pointing toward the window, is Julian Marsh. He isn't a consultant from London. He's Victor Renner's chief legal counsel and lead fixer. He makes witnesses disappear, Delaney. He buries bodies in legal paperwork and concrete. Delaney's heart stopped. The breath vanished from her lungs. The manifests. Oh my God, she whispered, hands flying to her mouth. The coffee shop. It wasn't an accident. He bumped into me. He saw the files. He was targeting me. Of course he was targeting you, Rocco roared, hitting the partition with the flat of his hand. You are the vault, Delaney. You know every shell corporation, every offshore account, every bribe we've paid for the last 7 years. You're the single most valuable piece on my board, and you let a Renner operative buy you a martini. I didn't know, Delaney yelled back, tears of frustration prickling her eyes. Because to me, he was just a man who actually looked at me. For 7 years, Rocco, I have been a piece of furniture in your life. I sit in the corner. I clean up your messes. I make sure you don't go to federal prison. And how do you repay me? You sit in a room with Victor Renner and tell him I'm just the help. You told him I eat the profits. You sat there and let them humiliate me. The silence that followed was deafening. The anger drained from Rocco's face, replaced by a stunned, hollow expression. He stared at her, truly looking at her, perhaps for the very first time. He saw the tears on her lashes, the flush of genuine heartbreak, the lush, womanly figure trembling beneath the silk. Delaney, he started, his voice stripped of its command. Don't, she interrupted, turning to the window, watching the blurred city lights. Julian might be a monster, but for 1 hour tonight he made me feel like a woman. Not a calculator, not an invisible assistant, a woman. I wore this dress. I spent 2 hours on my hair because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be seen. A brutal wave of self-loathing crashed over Rocco. He'd been so consumed by his empire, so obsessed with his ironclad rule, that he'd fundamentally neglected the one person who kept him anchored to the earth. He looked at her curves, the soft expanse of her skin, and realized with sickening clarity that his jealousy in the ballroom hadn't been about business at all. It had been primal, the terrifying realization that another man was touching what was his, except she wasn't his. He'd never claimed her. He'd only used her. But before he could speak, before he could articulate the sudden, violent realization of his own feelings, the car violently swerved. A deafening crack echoed through the night. The bulletproof glass on Delaney's side spiderwebbed perfectly, a high-caliber sniper round stopping mere millimeters from penetrating the cabin. Get down! Rocco roared, lunging across the seats, his massive frame crushing her down into the floorboards as a black SUV rammed into the side of the car, sending them spinning into the intersection. The trap hadn't just been Julian at the gala. The trap was right now. The world spun in a blur of screeching tires, shattering glass, and burning rubber. The heavy car slammed into a concrete barrier, the airbags deploying with a concussive blast. For a moment, there was nothing but ringing in Delaney's ears and the crushing weight of Rocco shielding her body with his own. Delaney, look at me. His voice broke through, urgent and rough, his hands mapping her body, checking for injuries. Are you hit? Are you bleeding? I'm okay, she gasped, coughing through the acrid smoke. She looked up and saw Marcus slumped over the wheel, unconscious, but breathing. Outside, the heavy boots of Renner hitmen splashed against the wet pavement. Julian hadn't just wanted information. Victor Renner had orchestrated a full decapitation strike while Rocco was distracted. Stay perfectly still, Rocco whispered, drawing a sleek, suppressed pistol from beneath his ruined jacket. The boss of the family was not just a man in a suit. He'd built his empire with his bare hands. But Delaney Cole was not just a secretary. As Rocco prepared to kick the jammed door open, she reached into the deep neckline of her gown and pulled a matte black emergency transponder from her clutch, which had spilled onto the floor. She pressed her thumb to the biometric scanner and entered a rapid sequence of commands. "What are you doing?" Rocco demanded, eyes widening. "I didn't just organize your calendar, Rocco," Delaney said, her voice dropping an octave, finding a spine of pure steel. "I designed your counter-surveillance grid." She pressed the final button. Instantly, the streetlights above the intersection exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the entire block into pitch darkness. At the same moment, a piercing high-frequency acoustic alarm, designed to disorient attackers, blared from the car's concealed speakers. The Renner hitmen screamed, dropping their weapons to clutch their ears. "Go!" Delaney shouted. Rocco didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open, moving with lethal, terrifying speed. In the cover of total darkness and deafening noise, he systematically neutralized the 4 armed men with ruthless precision. By the time the alarm cycled down, the street was silent, save for the rain and the groans of the incapacitated hitmen. Rocco stood in the rain, chest heaving, the pistol still gripped in his hand. He turned to see Delaney climbing out of the wrecked car. Her beautiful green dress was torn at the hem. Her hair was a wild, wet mess. She was barefoot, having abandoned her stilettos. And to Rocco, she had never looked more magnificent. She wasn't a fragile size 0 socialite who'd scream and faint at the sight of blood. She was a lush, brilliant, fierce survivor. Sirens began to wail in the distance, his backup, triggered automatically by her transponder, seconds away. Rocco holstered his weapon and walked slowly toward her, ignoring the rain, ignoring the destruction. He stopped inches from her and reached out a large, blood-stained hand to gently cup her jaw, his thumb tracing the soft curve of her cheek, smudging rainwater and ash. "I am a fool," Rocco said, his voice stripped of all its arrogance. "A blind, arrogant fool." "Rocco, no. Let me speak," he commanded softly, stepping closer until her curves pressed against his solid frame. "You are not the help, Delaney. You have never been the help. You are the only thing keeping me breathing. You are the only person I trust. And tonight, watching that bastard put his hands on you, it made me realize I would gladly burn this entire city to ash before I let another man touch what is mine." Her breath hitched. "Yours, mine," Rocco affirmed, his gaze dropping to her lips. "I see you, Delaney. I see your brilliant mind. I see your loyalty. And I see a woman whose body drives me to absolute madness. I was just too terrified to admit that the most powerful man in New York is entirely at the mercy of his assistant." He didn't wait for permission. He leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss that was desperate, hungry, and completely consuming, tasting of rain, bourbon, and 7 years of repressed longing. Delaney melted into him, her soft, generous body aligning perfectly with his hard edges. She wrapped her arms around his neck, finally stepping out of the shadows and claiming the space she'd always deserved. By the time the sleek black SUVs of the Salvatore family screeched to a halt, forming a protective perimeter, Rocco and Delaney were still holding each other in the rain. The next morning, the underworld of New York shifted. Victor Renner's offshore accounts were completely drained, the funds anonymously donated to charity, a final brilliant stroke of digital warfare executed by Delaney from the comfort of Rocco's penthouse. Julian Marsh was found tied to a chair in a federal prosecutor's office, surrounded by the exact shipping manifests he'd tried to steal, ensuring he'd never see the outside of a prison cell again. And as for Delaney Cole, she never wore a shapeless black blazer again. She walked into the boardroom that afternoon in a tailored crimson dress that hugged every glorious curve. She didn't sit in the corner taking notes. She sat at the head of the table, directly beside Rocco Salvatore, not as his invisible assistant, but as his equal, his partner, and the undisputed queen of his empire. So here's the thing worth taking away from all this. The most valuable person in the room is so often the one everybody's trained themselves not to see. The quiet one in the corner doing the real work while the flashy people get all the attention. Delaney was underestimated for 7 years, right up until the night she saved the life of the man who'd looked straight through her. And it turned out the woman he'd dismissed as just the help was the smartest, strongest, most irreplaceable person in his entire world. Now I want to hear from you. Did you love watching Delaney step out of the shadows and take her place at the head of that table? And watching Rocco finally wake up to the brilliant woman who'd been right in front of him the whole time? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I read every single one. If Delaney's rise gave you chills, do me a favor and smash that like button to show her some love. Share this story with someone who craves a real alpha romance. And subscribe so you never miss the next intense, passionate story. I'll see you in the next one.